This morning, I just want to give a general greeting and say hello to you. I'm Joe Skillen, one of the pastors here at the church, and it's my first chance to share on a Sunday morning, so I'm glad to be here to do that. And we also have an interview after sharing a bit from the scripture text this morning. We have a special guest, Denzel Goolsby, and he and Brent will join me on stage after I share from Acts chapter 10 for a little bit. But the theme is going to hard places this morning, and I think if you and I were to think of the first thing that comes to our mind when we think about going to hard places, we'd think all of the year 2020, right? Each of us had to do something difficult during 2020 as we dealt with social issues, cultural issues, and a global pandemic. And there's probably a few images that were common to many of us, and then some that may not be so common. There's just a couple pictures on the screen here. The one on the left is one that we're totally familiar with, where we were encouraged to wear masks as we went out in public, either in the office or school, or to the grocery store, and so we can be reminded of that. But the picture on the right also came from 2020, but you'll notice the difference. People close together with no masks on. But this is still a hard and difficult place. This actually comes from a story that the internet called Hotel Corona. You probably heard this story, but early in the pandemic era, when the Israeli government saw that there were increasing cases of COVID-19 in the city of Jerusalem, they required anyone who tested positive for COVID to quarantine in some of the hotels in the city. And it didn't matter who you were, where you came from. It didn't matter. You had COVID, so you had to go to this hotel until you tested negative for COVID, 2 straight tests. And so people from all over Jerusalem were living closer together than they had been in previous years. People who were Muslim or Jewish or atheists from all walks of life were told to live together in the same place. Now, residents of Israel, Jerusalem in particular, were a little bit worried about this. In fact, they were asking, is this going to work? Like, this seems like a difficult thing for any of us to be asked to do. But as life upon life joined Hotel Corona, and as they had meals together, they found that they could actually get along with one another. But there were some challenging moments during this time in their stay at Hotel Corona. For instance, there was this girl, she's a 20-year-old Bedouin Muslim girl named Aisha, and she was going back to her room after a meal one day, and as she turned the corner, she saw someone way down in the hallway who was on the floor struggling to breathe, and so she immediately sprung into action, and she went closer and closer to this person. She got about 10 feet from this person, and she realized that he was a young Orthodox male Jewish person, and she was a Bedouin Muslim girl. For her whole life, she was told by her community to avoid people like him. And there's a good chance that for all of his life, he was told to avoid people like her. And so she got 10 feet closer, and she had a decision to make. Her first impulse was to try to help this person, but there was all these barriers between the two of them. And if she was going to help him, it was going to require not just walking another 10 feet, but it was going to require pushing through some of those social barriers. So she was left with a question: what should I do in the midst of this hard place? And I think all of us have been in a similar situation where we're in a hard place. And our first impulse is to spring into action, but that impulse to act collides with inner barriers within us that give us the same moment of pause like it did Aisha. There's several things that operate inside in these moments, but maybe a few of them that we can discuss this morning. The first one is a social map. All of us were given social maps as kids. Our family and our community and our church and things in culture tell us how to live life, and so we don't realize it, but we have the social map always in front of us telling us what to do in certain moments, and we certainly take away and we add to our social map as we navigate life. Sometimes it's practical things, like we really hated speech class in high school. We were terrified of public speaking, and it was confirmed during that class. And so we take out our social map and we say, if you can avoid speaking in public, do so at all costs. And it goes on the social map. But our exposure to media, to books, to the big texts and stories and leaders out there also shapes who we are, and it shapes our social map. And so sometimes in hard places, we find that we don't jump into activity because it contradicts our social map. But that leads to a second thing, our previous experiences. For whatever reason, our soul attaches to hard and difficult past experiences. It's like Velcro on our mind and in our soul. And so we've had a previous experience in the past that didn't work out so well. We tend to avoid and try to avoid that same experience, which leads us to something else that happens in this moment of a hard place. We have an inner critic who taunts us. Just like the loud guy in the first row at a football game, each of us have an inner critic that ridicules us when we try to make changes. He begins to raise his voice, or she begins to raise her voice and says, well, look at this tough guy. He thinks he's going to try something new. And he begins to remind us about that time that we made that New Year's resolution. We vowed we were going to make changes, and it didn't last to even Valentine's Day. She reminds us of those things, and those things give us pause, and we don't move forward. But here's the key question for the morning. How do we push through the barriers that we have inside, these and others, and not just survive in a hard place, but thrive in a hard place of life and faith? Because in life, we will be in hard places from time to time. In the Christian faith, we will be led to hard places from time to time. Christianity takes guts. It's not for wimps. Have we read the teachings of Jesus lately? He tells us to love our enemies and things that are challenging for us in our human experience. And so we know we're going to be in hard places. We can't avoid them. They're either going to surprise us or we can see them coming from a mile away. And so we have to have a game plan about what we're going to do from here. You know, some of us are in a hard place right now. We walked into the room and I'm just kind of touching on a soft spot in some of our souls. For some of us, we would like to be a little bit more deliberate in our faith walk, but we don't know where to begin. And it's kind of a sore subject for us. It's hard to figure out what to do next. Maybe we want to start praying with our spouse. Everyone assumes that we're doing so, but we're not. But we'd love to do so, but how do you break the ice to do such a thing, right? For some of us, we've had a relationship go awry, and there's a need to express forgiveness towards one another. But somebody hurt us so much, we don't know if we want to put ourselves in a place of vulnerability around them again. We don't know if they are trustworthy. It's hard to even imagine extending forgiveness. For some of us, we've been praying and God's been leading us, nudging us towards a new wild dream. But it's going to require us to let go of a lot of comforts, a lot of things that we know so well in order to leap into the unknown. And so we're excited about this new thing that God's calling us to, but there's so much that's holding us back. We don't know how to take our first steps towards this new unrealized dream. Still, some of us, we have a habit in our life that we haven't told anybody about. Not even the person who's closest to us, because it is so embarrassing. Its shadow is so long over our lives and so dark in our lives that we would be so ashamed to even mention it. And so we have this interesting dilemma. Do I continue to limp and to walk as a wounded person and keep it a secret? Or do I drag it out in the open and pursue healing and to be transformed and changed? How do we thrive in a hard place? Well, I think our passage from Acts chapter 10 and 11 will help us to have some guiding steps to lead us forward to thrive in our hard place this morning. Acts chapter 10 and 11 revolves around two different characters. The first character that we meet is a guy named Cornelius. We haven't met him yet. He is a centurion in the Roman army, which means he's potentially in charge of 5,000 soldiers. If he had his army military uniform on, he would have tons of medals. Like he would jingle as he walked through the door into the next room. But he also has a soft spiritual side. Luke tells us that he prays to God and he gives alms to the poor. And so one day he's praying to God, and lo and behold, to his surprise, an angel shows up. So we see in Acts chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, that he and the angel have a conversation. The angel answered Cornelius and said, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men from here to Joppa, a nearby city, to bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter." So when an angel tells you to do something, you do it, right? And so he sent some of these guys on their way to Joppa. And as this is happening, Peter's in Joppa. He doesn't live there, but he's visiting there. He probably had to take out like an Airbnb reservation. And maybe because money was short, Luke tells us that he's sleeping and spending time on a rooftop. I've heard that you and I could go to Jerusalem today And we can get an Airbnb on somebody's roof for pretty cheap. And so maybe Peter's a cheapskate. That's where he's staying at this time. And he's praying before God. And his prayer is interrupted. He sees a vision. And it's a sheet that's coming down from heaven. And it's got several unclean animals. Animals that he is told that he's never to eat in his life because of his Jewish faith. And so all these animals are there. He's probably startled by all that's happening. And a voice booms from the vision. It's the voice of God. And God says, Peter, get up, kill, and eat. But this is so surprising to Peter that he resists. In fact, we look at verse 16 of Acts chapter 10. Peter has to receive this vision 3 times. You and I know that if you're raising kids or taking care of kids, you typically have to repeat something 3 times. And it's because the first couple of times there's resistance. And so Peter resists once, twice, and it comes back again. And we read further, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of this vision and going a little bit further, while Peter was still speaking about the vision, the Spirit said to him. So what Peter is taking in is something completely new. This is not on his social map. This is nothing he could anticipate God ever leading him to. And he's scratching his head. He's sifting his soul. He wonders what he's supposed to do next. What Peter does here is the first step in our process of thriving in a hard place, and that is to allow your curiosity, my curiosity, to be stronger than our embedded reactions. Peter could have said, nope, I'm not going to do it. I want to please God and my mama. I'm not going to follow through with what this vision is telling me to do. But Peter said, who knows? Who knows what God could be doing in the midst of this? You and I take our first step in our hard place when we resist those inner barriers and we say to God, God, this is going to be completely new. This is my first time doing this. But who knows what you might be up to? So Peter cancels his reservation. He follows the men from Joppa to Caesarea, where Cornelius' home is, and he meets with Cornelius. He meets him for the first time, and they begin to have a conversation. We see in verse 28, the beginning of that conversation, Peter begins to address Cornelius, and he says, Cornelius, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or even visit a Gentile. A Gentile is just a junk drawer term for everyone else who's not a Jew or a Samaritan. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. Now, everyone who is Jewish in the crowd with Peter would have agreed with the first part of this statement. But the second part of this statement would have been brand new knowledge for them. It would have been startling. In fact, if people were allowed to have Twitter back then and they were live tweeting this keynote from Peter, they would have quoted him, and then they would have posted this side-eyed Chloe meme in reaction to this scandalous claim. People who wanted, like Peter, who wanted to please God and their mamas and their rabbi back home, they don't say these things. But Peter is stumbling into some new knowledge about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So he gives us the second thing here about how to thrive in a hard place. He clearly acknowledged the obstacle in the room without blame or self-justification. Notice that Peter didn't say, I would have gotten around to coming around to talk to you folks, but I wasn't told to do so until now. No, Peter just acknowledged the awkwardness in the room. But he also vowed that he wanted to continue to learn, to listen, to understand. In the same way, if you and I find ourselves in a hard place, we might be alongside people that we don't necessarily agree with. And so here's an axiom, something that we should, a word of wisdom that we should hold in these moments, which is, it's better to win a friend than an argument in these scenarios. And how we win a friend and resist the argument is acknowledge the obstacle and be open to a fruitful conversation. Now, this is a hard place for Peter, but he goes even further than we've ever expected. We continue on, and as Peter's continued to address Cornelius, he says this in verse 34, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. The operative word in this moment, in this phrase, is now. Now is a reference to time. A spouse says, I now realize that when you say that you're tired, you're not really tired. You just don't want to talk anymore. Didn't know that before. I know that now. Peter did not know this. And this is a scandalous claim. People like him would have not said this. They would have said, no, we are God's unique chosen people. He has shown his favoritism towards us according to our father Abraham. And so as Peter says this, if there's any Jews in the room, once again, live tweeting this keynote event, the side-eyed Chloe's coming back on the screen. Peter is saying something that's outlandish. He's breaking rank from everything that everyone else agrees with. And he's launching into the unknown on a wild goose chase with God. Which brings us to the third and critical step of how to thrive in a hard place. It's to take our leap. It's actually to engage in action. Because curiosity is good, but you can be curious without any action. You can acknowledge the obstacle in the room without taking any action. What's critical to thriving in the hard place is to leap into the unknown. And Peter does so here. He probably frustrated some people in the room that were Jewish. He probably frustrated people, and he probably still had some things to figure out. He didn't have all the algebra decided in his mind of how this is supposed to work, but he had this impulse that God was up to something new, and so he decided to take the leap. And let's be honest, because he opened the door for salvation for Cornelius and his people, part of our ability to have heard the gospel of Jesus Christ came from the risky move that Peter does in Acts chapter 10. When the gospel goes to the Gentiles, it now has access to the ends of the earth, and the world is changed because of it. Because Peter decided to take a critical action at a critical moment. Which brings us back to the hallway in Hotel Corona. Aisha was there, and she's 10 feet from helping this guy, but there was so much still dividing herself and this person that's on the ground. And so instead of running away and holding on to her social map and keeping things as business as usual in their culture, she decided to move closer and closer to him, to bend down to his level, to actually touch him, and to whisper in his ear that she's going to help and she's going to bring some more help along the way. And many people believe that her critical steps there, her risky behavior there, was the reason that he got the medical attention for his life to be spared in that moment. But the story didn't even end there. Because as Aisha left Hotel Corona after testing negative for COVID-19, she immediately quit her job as a custodian at the hospital. She enrolled to be a nurse in training so that as she worked in hospitals in Jerusalem, she could help any person in any room that she was sent to, regardless of who they are or where they came from. And it all started because she decided to take a risk. I think one of the things that prevents us from moving forward and going towards the hard places is that we feel like we're going to be all alone, or we're going to be misunderstood, or that everyone's going to abandon us. But I think that we could share stories again and again of how when we decide to go to the hard place and leap into the unknown, that God actually sends people to meet us there for an uncanny cooperation and community. The person who wrote the story about Hotel Corona on NPR's Rough Translation, his name is Gregory Warner. As he was wrapping up his thoughts about what he experienced when he interviewed all these people, this is what he said in closing. He said, "I once interviewed a reality TV show producer who confessed just how hard it is to get people to fight enough to keep it interesting. He said you have to cast characters and exploit the right moments, stoke the conflict because people," he says, and I want us to get this, "as individuals are frustratingly good at getting along." There are powers in our culture that want us to imagine that this is not true, that divisions are too deep, that the stakes are too high to engage in cooperation with one another. But what the book of Acts tells us, what the gospel of Jesus tells us, what Aisha's story tells us, and what many other stories that we could hear tell us, is that if we take our leap, that God will meet us there, and we'll have some cooperative friends to help us to navigate a new day forward. I think this is a good place for us to invite Brent and for Denzel to come forward as we continue to drill down deeper and do a deeper dive on one critical issue in our culture that's going to take a lot of cooperation. As they come up, let's have a word of prayer this morning. God, we thank you that you sent Jesus to be our advocate and to be our help. We thank you that you continue to lead us to hard places because we are transformed and changed when we go there. So God, as we continue a conversation and pivot towards talking about a particular issue in our culture, I pray that grace and mercy would abound and that our hearts would be opened and that you would speak to us so that we can know what to do next. We ask all these things in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, amen. Let's welcome to the stage Brent and Denzel Goolsby, our special guests this morning.
Good morning. So we do want to continue the conversation about going to hard places and go into this area of what are the hard places we could go to in the whole racial divide that we are in our nation. I know there's a sense, and I pick it up, and there are days I feel like this thing never ends, this fight, and the tension, and the protests, and the anger, and the accusations, and the finger pointing, and there are certainly times when we want to just give up, like, are we ever going to conquer? We want to say that, with Joe, it's what he said, we get tired of fighting the bad habit. We get tired of the broken relationship, and we just want to throw in the towel, tap out. But it's just important that we deal with this and we keep fighting this thing and try and do the right thing. So this is Denzel Goolsby, and as a Christian, that's his first identity. I'm a Christian. And then I might say I'm a husband. You're a husband. I'm a father. At some point, the color of our skin gets on the pecking order list of what defines us. And I'm white, Denzel's black. So we wanted to invite him to share, and we're going to ask a few questions, see where this thing goes this morning and what progress we might be able to make. So Denzel, welcome. Tell us a little bit about, the beautiful lady over there and a little bit about your life, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, born and raised in West Wichita, so went to high school at Bishop Carroll. And was blessed to meet Katie Kramer at K-State, who was playing soccer there.
Wildcat fans?
And
there's a few. Okay.
And so Katie grew up in this church, and we ended up meeting there and falling in love. You married us last summer, and so now that I'm done, my playing days are over. Lost all my muscle and starting to look like you. So, yeah.
We're going to have a little arm wrestling match afterwards. I'm going to school him. So you played football. Tell us a little bit about that.
Body feels a lot better now that I don't have to wake up every day and have as many workouts as I did. But yeah, so I played played football there for 4 years, redshirted my first year. I was able to play under Snyder and also Coach Kleiman, so I had a really great time.
Well, thanks for being here. Yeah. So let's just go straight to the title of the sermon,
Sure.
Going to Hard Places. We're not going to make any progress in this unless we do what Joe was talking about, like go to hard places. So 1, 2, 3, can you just toss out a few hard places that we as individuals or as an overwhelmingly white church, what can we do to try to make a difference?
I don't think it starts at church. I think it starts at home, right? Being a Christian on Sunday, the goal is not to say, how can I be the best Christian? That starts on Sunday. It starts at home. So the hard place, I believe, is what are we doing, on Monday, and how are we talking to our friends, and what are the things that we're feeding our mind, and how do we show up around our own group of people, right? The people that we constantly surround ourselves with. So from there, then we can have the harder conversations with people that maybe they don't look just like us, or maybe their experiences are different. And so to just understand, you have to start small, and mentally, what do you feel you're capable of, and how vulnerable are you willing to be, and to put those barriers down in your own mind about where progress can continue to go, and just being more open-minded. And then as far as once you go from there, the actions can be simple things like, instead of watching a Disney movie with the kids, maybe we turn on a movie that's a little bit different than that shows a little bit of maybe former struggles that certain people had to go through. I know you were talking a little bit too about just how you've educated your kids, and I thought that's the coolest thing, that you didn't have to go do that. So sometimes it's just that simple, just starting at home, and then you can go out and into the community, do different things.
That's awesome. And you had mentioned last night, and he referenced that,
Yeah.
something that you've heard about for what can we do as a white person to try to connect somehow.
Yeah, there's a professor that I follow, and he, not only in college but also in his family life, they take a civil rights bus tour. They take the opportunity to do that as a vacation. We go to some of the prominent places during the civil rights era, places like Atlanta and Birmingham, and you get to hear stories and get to see where it happened. And he said probably the best part of that trip is the long spaces in between visits where you get to sit alone and think. You get to hear the story, and the story weighs on you. I've heard that the freight of truth is carried in a story, right? And the more stories that we get to hear, the more truth we get to hear. And I think that'd be a critical piece. So that's what our family's going to do. Avery and Ezra cannot get their inheritance without taking a civil rights bus tour. There's a few critical things, and that's going to be one of them. And so I can't wait to do that with them when they're a little bit older.
I'll sign up for the inheritance.
There's not a lot there yet, as you know, as preachers, right? Yeah. Denzel, I think people of faith are prone to action. Jesus tells us to take up our cross. So we don't just think about this stuff, we want to do something. I think that's the common thing that I hear. But not all action is good or helpful, I guess I would say. So as you've been engaging in this topic, and as you've been watching the world react, particularly this past year, what's been helpful and maybe what's been not so helpful, so that any of us who want to do something, to go to the hard place, we have a little bit of a direction and a heading after today?
Yeah. Well, what hasn't been helpful is the state of, I think, the culture and media and the climate has been so toxic. And so I think that feeding into the narratives that some people see on media, knowing that they can be quickly just always focusing on the negatives. And so I'm conscious of what am I feeding my mind, and how do I see those things, and do I challenge them, or do I just accept them for face value? Because we can mess up some really simple storylines, let alone such huge topics, right? Like I know when Katie and we were at K-State, there was a sports writer that talked about how we met on Twitter. We met at the complex, the sports complex. So it's like, that's a very small topic, let alone talking about race and injustice and things like that. So media has a tendency to really hijack a narrative, and so I think people just need to be just conscious of sometimes what that can do to their own thinking, the compound effect of constantly seeing that stuff. I also think that, pointing the finger like we've talked about, or seeing it as an agenda that it's not, right, like a political thing, or making it a debate, trying to win over an argument, that nobody's going to get there. So instead of trying to bring your viewpoint to where I'm at, or vice versa, let's just find the common ground that we can both agree on, and to understand we don't always have to agree. Like, that's great. We don't have to do that, and sometimes that's a fine thing. We're human. So.
Yeah. And rarely can you yell someone to your side.
Exactly.
Rarely can you throw out a statistic and, oh yeah, I agree. Yeah. It's done in relationship. It's done in trust, and it's often done one-on-one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
So a question I have for you is...
Is this like a quarterback sack or something?
Yeah.
Like, turn the tables?
So there's been the quote about Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. being one of the most segregated times in America. You being a pastor here, right? Predominantly white church. Should that be a goal to make a church more diverse, or is that even important, right? Like, is that something that, based on the community around it, is that necessary, or is it the goal really just to be the best Christians and go from there? It's you. That's for you.
Okay. So in the book of Revelation, it paints this ideal picture: every tribe and nation, language and tongue. Where language and culture and economic class and skin color are all just erased. There's still different language, there's still different skin color up in heaven, but something's been made perfect. And so, there is a pressure, I think, Denzel, that, we need to be multi-ethnic, and yet 67205 is in the upper 90 percentile of Caucasian, white. 67212 across 21st Street, a little more diverse, but not much. And so is that just a backdoor exit that I can kind of, we're just a reflection of our community. I struggle. I really do. I'm ready to move on to the next question because I honestly don't know how to do this. Are we? I think if we took a poll, we'd all love to have a wide variety of people here. We'd love that. But it's also true that this side of heaven, birds of a feather flock together. And as humans, we tend to connect with people that are like us. And depending on your attitude, your heart, that might not be a bad thing. It might be a bad thing. Beyond all that, I just want our church to deal with the question. We are overwhelmingly white. And I honestly don't have a finish line. I don't know what the target is. I just believe that God has called us to be relevant in our world, and there's a race war going on. And let's at least talk about it and see where it leads.
You have anything to add?
Yeah, I think diversity is not a quota thing. I think it's a heart posture. I mean, Barna has said recently that, a fair amount of our African-American friends, when they go to church with their white friends, they feel like they have to check a bit of who they are at the door in order to be able to navigate church culture. And so I think diversity also looks like, can people come here and be themselves? And I think that's where God is honored. And so I would hope that we'd strive to whatever that looks like, but that would be the heart behind all of it. Yeah. So, okay, well, maybe one last question as we wrap up. I think MLK, as he thought about the long struggle towards racial justice, he said that the narrative arc of creation is long, but it bends towards justice. So we might be at the struggle a while, but we're moving towards more and more hopeful days in his mind. So yes, there's a lot of challenges and pressures, but what do you see today that makes you hopeful for today and for the years ahead, Denzel?
I think now more than ever, people are open to just having conversations like this, which is refreshing and it's needed. And to do it in light of not having like an aggressive posture toward it, like just being curious, how can we continue to grow together and to connect with one another? And I think that 3 years ago, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation right now. But so maybe the silver lining in how crazy of the past year has been is forcing more people to pay attention. And really, it's not a race issue, it's a people issue. How can we connect with one another better? I didn't look at Katie and say, I'm gonna marry her right away. It's like, how can I get to know her? How can I learn what she's passionate about? How can I listen? And so that across the board is really just at the core level, how do we connect with people? And I think more than ever, we're learning how we can engage with one another. We're learning how we can connect, how we can listen, how we can really understand what somebody's going through, rather than just say, I'm gonna be a friend with that person, because I don't think that's practical. Like, let's take steps back and figure out how we just start to connect and engage, and then from there you can become a friend.
I like it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, everybody, let's give Denzel a hand for joining us and sharing. Appreciate that.
Let's give Joe a hand. First day here, man, you crushed it. So.
Did good. Yeah.